In the 20th century, the Summit Conference was reinvented. Air travel allowed statesmen to confront each other on a world stage. Mass media communicated their decisions instantly to a truly global audience. But does summitry make the world a safer place? When leaders meet, the aim is to resolve disputes and ease tension. But sometimes the verbal duel becomes so vicious that it scars the whole relationship. (1961), one of the tensest moments of the Cold War between the superpowers. The Soviet Union seemed to be winning the space race and was widely believed to have opened up a missile gap in nuclear weapons. And the Americans and Soviets were facing off in Berlin, which, it was feared, could be the flashpoint for a catastrophic Third World War. The stakes were therefore immense when John F. Kennedy, the new young American president, met Nikita Khrushchev, the veteran Soviet leader, in Vienna in June 1961. Both men craved international success to silence critics at home. And each was convinced he could achieve what he wanted. These were two huge egos, shot through with vulnerabilities. Vienna exposed the very human frailties of two world leaders. Khrushchev, with his deep inferiority complex and fiery temper that pushed him to posture and score points at every opportunity. Kennedy, a far cry from the youthful icon, still feeling his way into an unfamiliar role. Crippled by intense back pain and pumped up by powerful drugs. The result was a massive clash of personalities played out over 2 days. It created profound misunderstandings. And worse, misguided policies, pushing the world to the brink of nuclear destruction over Cuba, and dragging America into a war in Vietnam that almost tore the country apart. Vienna in 1961 is a rare case of how jaw can nearly provoke war. It was, I think, the most ill-judged encounter of the Cold War. This is the story of how and why a summit can go horribly wrong. The push for a summit came from a new man in the Kremlin. Nikita Khrushchev was the son of poor peasants from southern Russia. Clever and ambitious, but uneducated, he wanted to become an engineer. But after the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, he threw himself into politics. He was party boss in the Ukraine and a political commissar at Stalingrad. He rose rapidly as Stalin's pet. Exuberant, energetic and loyal, but also unthreatening. Not least because at 5'1", he was even shorter than the self-conscious dictator. So it was easy to underestimate this coarse little man with his piggy eyes and ceaseless talk. But after Stalin's death, Khrushchev sidelined one rival after another to become the undisputed leader of his country. behind the bullish exterior, Khrushchev was a complex figure. He was sensitive to any hint of condescension about his lack of culture and education, and unlike Stalin, he found it hard to control his explosive temper, often alternating from effusive good humour to foul-mouthed abuse in a few moments. This was no natural diplomat.
Беснуется лакей империализма, но ничего сделать не может, как скала стоит наша Родина социалистическая.
Yet Khrushchev was a genuine believer in the potential of communism. He was determined to improve living standards for ordinary Russians. Better food and more consumer goods. But that meant cutting back the costly Soviet military-industrial complex. And that in turn would require diplomacy, a deal to end the arms race with the United States. So Khrushchev's aim was to browbeat the Americans into arms control, which might win him real breathing space for the economy at home. Khrushchev's pressure yielded results, and he was invited to America in September 1959. The Soviet leader was jubilant.
Who would have guessed 20 years ago that the most powerful capitalist country in the world would invite a communist to visit? This is incredible. Today, they have to take us into account. It is our strength that has led to this.
Under pressure from Khrushchev, the West was moving towards a summit. But summitry had been under a cloud throughout the Cold War. Chamberlain's meeting at Munich had become a byword for sellout. The same was true of Churchill and Roosevelt's meeting with Stalin at Yalta in 1945. The lesson seemed to be that it was risky for democracies to talk to dictatorships. The yearning for peace at any price would be too strong. And now, in the 1950s, the American State Department was afraid of what the folksy, golfing President Dwight Eisenhower might do if left alone with Khrushchev. But it was hard to ignore the pressures of Western public opinion. During Khrushchev's visit to America, Eisenhower finally agreed to formal talks. But in May 1960, just 2 weeks before the scheduled summit in Paris, the Cold War went critical.
Об этом дне не стоит забывать. Он едва не оказался роковым.
The Soviets shot down an American U-2 spy plane and captured its pilot. This incursion into Russian airspace increased Soviet suspicions of Western capitalist aggression.
Данные аэрофотосъемки, анализ печатных изданий, дипломатические каналы, данные радиотелефонного перехвата. Ничем не брезгует империалистическая разведка, которую столь откровенно изобразил журнал Newsweek.
To save face, Khrushchev had little choice but to torpedo the summit for which he'd pressed so long. This meant any hope of a breakthrough in East-West relations would have to await a new leader in Washington.
You, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, do solemnly swear.
I, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, do solemnly swear.
That you will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
That I will faithfully execute.
On the 21st of January 1961, John F. Kennedy delivered his inaugural address in front of the US Capitol. It was a richly symbolic moment. Despite the biting cold, the 43-year-old president was bareheaded, without a topcoat, the very image of youthful vitality.
The torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans born in this century, tempered by war.
Kennedy told the world,
"We shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe to assure the survival and the success of liberty."
But despite what sounded like a clarion call to Cold War confrontation, behind the scenes, Kennedy genuinely wanted dialogue with the Soviets, remarking that
it is far better that we meet at the summit than at the brink.
Unlike many presidents, Kennedy had thought about history. As an undergraduate at Harvard, he wrote a thesis about Chamberlain's negotiations with Hitler. Published in 1940 under the title Why England Slept, it became a bestseller. Contrary to the American stereotype of Chamberlain as a doddering old man who was completely taken in by Hitler, Kennedy argued,
Chamberlain could not have fought even if he'd wanted to. Munich was inevitable on the grounds of lack of armaments alone.
20 years on, now president, Kennedy remained mindful of that lesson. He believed a democracy could negotiate with a dictatorship, but it had to bargain from a position of strength and a readiness for war. As he put it with a typical rhetorical flourish,
"Let us never negotiate out of fear, but let us never fear to negotiate."
But summitry wasn't just an intellectual issue, it was also intensely personal. Kennedy felt driven to sense out the adversary, and that was rooted in his character and upbringing. John F. Kennedy's father, Joseph, a ruthless multimillionaire, was determined to get his family into the White House. When the eldest son, Joe Jr., was killed in the war, that mantle fell on John, known in the family as Jack. But whereas Joe seemed a natural politician, dynamic, sociable, and easygoing, Jack, his father said later, was rather shy, withdrawn and quiet, and seemed like a budding teacher or writer. So for Jack, climbing the political ladder involved a huge effort. He married well and projected a happy family image. Yet, like his father, he carried on numerous affairs in private. Even more damaging for his presidency, and less well known, behind the good looks and athletic manner, the real Jack Kennedy was often virtually a cripple. Since his teens, he'd suffered from ulcers and humiliating diarrhea. The drugs he took for these aggravated a severe adrenal condition known as Addison's disease. He'd had a metal plate inserted in his chronically weak back, and even so, he often couldn't bend to tie his own shoelaces. On top of this, he suffered repeated bladder infections, the result of his promiscuous sex life. Kennedy was in appalling physical condition for a man of his age. But he was also a ferociously determined personality. Instead of being an excuse for a quiet life, his ailments drove him on. And I think it was this personal dimension, as much as any intellectual approach to summitry, that would shape Kennedy's problematic relationship with Khrushchev.
снова Вашингтон.
The two men had met in 1959 during the Soviet leader's visit to America. It had been a brief encounter, but long enough for Khrushchev to touch a raw nerve when he told Kennedy that he looked too young to be a senator. Kennedy was always sensitive to hints that he lacked gravitas and experience, and the barb stuck. So on becoming president, Kennedy wanted a second round. His Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, thought this would be a risky gamble. Better for the diplomats to do the groundwork rather than letting the young president tangle so soon with this hardened Soviet leader. But Kennedy had no doubts about his own capacities. He composed a letter to Khrushchev.
I hope it will be possible before too long for us to meet personally for an informal exchange of views.
Khrushchev quickly agreed in principle, clearly pleased that the president shared his desire to get up close and personal. It seemed that Kennedy and Khrushchev's relationship had got off to a good start. But what happened next shifted the power balance between the two countries and decisively affected how each leader read the other. Kennedy's aim was negotiation for strength, but in April 1961, America suddenly seemed pathetically weak. Thanks to Yuri Gagarin, the Soviet Union became the first country to put a man into space. And far worse was to follow.
Behind this change is the story of the betrayal of the Cuban people. It began when Fidel Castro triumphantly entered Havana in 1959 after 6 years of revolt.
The Cuban Revolution of 1959 drove out a corrupt dictatorship dominated by American economic interests. The new Cuban leader, Fidel Castro, then turned to communism and got into bed with Moscow. A further blow to American prestige, taking shape just 90 miles off the coast of Florida.
Castro had sold out to Premier Khrushchev and the communists.
Kennedy regarded the new Cuba as a tool of Khrushchev's plans to expand communist influence throughout Latin America. But feeling his way in the new job, the president was wary of committing America overtly to toppling Castro. Instead of a conventional invasion by American forces, Kennedy agreed a CIA plan for an operation by Cuban exiles with minimal American support. But landed on the remote Bay of Pigs on the 17th of April, with virtually no air cover, the Cuban exiles crumbled within a couple of days. Kennedy could not conceal the failure or shrug off the blame. Tearfully, he hugged his wife Jackie in the White House bedroom. Acute diarrhea and another urinary tract infection added to his misery. His presidency had been humiliated at the very start, and he must have feared for his hopes of thawing the Cold War. Cuba could have been used by Khrushchev as a pretext for killing off another summit. But for the Soviet leader, there could be no better moment to pressurize a weakened president. In early May, Khrushchev's foreign minister, Andrei Gromyko, asked whether Kennedy still wanted a personal meeting, making it clear that the Soviet Union still thought this would be useful. Despite the president's mantra of not negotiating from a position of weakness, he now needed a meeting to improve his international image. Gromyko quickly received a positive response. And through diplomatic back channels, Kennedy signaled he didn't just want an exchange of views, but real progress. Above all, a treaty banning nuclear tests. That didn't interest Khrushchev, but in his astonishment at Kennedy's vacillations over Cuba, he saw a real opportunity to get much more out of the summit.
I don't understand Kennedy. What's wrong with him? Can he really be that indecisive? Khrushchev was genuinely perplexed. The president had failed to unleash American power against Castro, and his willingness to talk so soon after the Cuban debacle was a further sign of weakness. Little wonder the Soviet leader felt confident that he could browbeat his opponent into what he wanted, a deal on Berlin.
Germany was the great unresolved problem of the Cold War. The country was split in two, and its former capital was now a divided city, marooned inside Soviet-controlled East Germany. But the West would not acknowledge the East German regime run by Walter Ulbricht. If it did this, then it would be accepting the Soviet policy of permanently dividing Germany.
And here is Big Brother himself. The great dictator embraces the little dictator.
Khrushchev wanted a formal peace treaty to end World War II and legally recognize the Ulbricht government. He saw Berlin as vital leverage. Throwing down the gauntlet, Khrushchev threatened that if they did not conclude a German peace treaty, the Soviets would hand over all their rights in Berlin to Ulbricht. That way, if the West wanted to maintain access to its half of Berlin, it would have to come to terms with East Germany.
On the face of it, Khrushchev had made a shrewd move. He likened Berlin to the West's testicles. "If I want to make the West scream," he said, "I squeeze on Berlin."
Yet the city was also a vulnerable part of the Soviet anatomy, used as a gateway by a flood of refugees from the East German police state. Of the 2.7 million who crossed into West Berlin to seek a better life during the 1950s, most were the young and better educated, whose skills and energy were vital for the communist economy. The Soviet Union had to do something, or its showcase country in Eastern Europe might collapse from within. Khrushchev's aides joked grimly that soon there'd be no one left in the country except Ulbricht and his mistress. So for Khrushchev, Berlin was both a problem and an opportunity. If he could resolve the crisis and the armed standoff in the city by pushing through a treaty, he might be able to realize his long-term goal of reducing the arms burden on the Soviet people. For both sides, Berlin would be the crux of the summit. And yet neither the Soviets nor the Americans came to the table with imaginative ways to resolve it. In all the preparations for the summit, there was a gaping hole at the center. The only top American policymaker who sensed Khrushchev's concern on Berlin was the US ambassador in Moscow, Llewellyn Thompson. He'd been urging Washington to show some flexibility on Germany, but this was very much a minority report. Likewise, most of the Soviet leadership was hawkish and rigid. Only Deputy Premier Anastas Mikoyan argued for compromise with Kennedy on Germany, rather than backing him into a corner. But, like Thompson, Mikoyan was a lone dove. His doubts, voiced at the last Politburo meeting before the summit, infuriated Khrushchev, who threatened to shoot down any Allied plane trying to land in Berlin. At the end of this stormy meeting, Khrushchev approved a list of gifts for Kennedy and his wife at Vienna. "Presents can be given," he sneered, "even before a war." Both Kennedy and Khrushchev were marching boldly toward the summit, but following very different maps. The world had moved a long way from the days of Hitler and Chamberlain. Communications had been transformed and information was much fuller. Yet the psychological barriers to summitry remained exactly the same. Vienna had been selected as a suitably neutral capital. But after the wobbles of the last few months, the summit had to be organised in just 3 weeks. Khrushchev made his way to the Austrian capital by train through the Eastern Bloc. It was a leisurely journey lasting a week. Kennedy's build-up, by contrast, was hectic. It had begun in mid-May with a state visit to Canada.
Ce voyage est le premier que je fais hors des États-Unis depuis mon élection à la présidence de mon pays.
Kennedy's French accent hadn't been the only disaster. While stooping to plant a ceremonial tree, he'd also put out his fragile back. In private, he had to resort to crutches for the first time in years. Next came a grueling 2-day state visit to Paris, hosted by America's most prickly ally, Charles de Gaulle. To make matters worse, the French crowd seemed more fascinated by his wife. The president felt upstaged, and it rankled.
I do not think it altogether inappropriate to introduce myself to this audience. I am the man who accompanied Jacqueline Kennedy to Paris.
Unknown to all but his innermost circle, the president was by now in excruciating pain from his back. Throughout his European visit, Kennedy tried to ease his problem by taking long, hot baths. The White House doctor administered injections of procaine into his lower back, as well as a heady mixture of assorted drugs to control the other embarrassing problems with his plumbing. But Kennedy had also asked Dr. Max Jacobson, a maverick New York physician, to fly secretly to Paris and Vienna. Jacobson's New York nickname was Dr. Feelgood, and his specialty was amphetamines with which he injected Kennedy daily. Some of the president's entourage thought that Jacobson was a quack, but Kennedy believed that taking speed was the only way to avoid meeting de Gaulle and Khrushchev as a cripple. As he put it, "I don't care if it's horse piss, it works."
This was the scene at Vienna's airport when President Kennedy's plane arrived on the morning of Saturday, June 3rd. The world...
It was raining when the Kennedys finally flew into Vienna on the morning of the summit itself. Kennedy cannot have been relaxed in mind or body. By the time he arrived at the American ambassador's residence, the venue for day one of the summit, it was well after noon. Khrushchev was due at 12:45. There was just time for Dr. Jacobson to administer a quick injection. As the Soviet motorcade drew up, Kennedy, tanked up by excitement and no doubt by the drugs, strode down the steps, apparently in the pink of health. The portly Khrushchev, aged 67 to the president's 43, came up to his nose. Posing for the press, the two men joked awkwardly about their age difference. Khrushchev irritated Kennedy by recalling that in 1959 he'd heard of him as a promising young politician. Kennedy had not forgotten the apparent snub. The first day of meetings would take place in the music room, overlooking the garden. The two leaders sat on opposite sides of a coffee table, with an interpreter and their closest advisors. The duel had begun. Khrushchev quickly seized the initiative. The United States must recognize that communism exists and has won its right to develop. Kennedy hit back. The Soviet Union is trying to eliminate free governments allied to the United States. That is a matter of very serious concern to Americans. Kennedy should have cut out the rhetoric and got down to substance. Instead, he was getting sucked into an ideological argument. A very bad mistake. Through long diatribes that became even more ponderous in translation, Khrushchev hammered on about how communism would triumph not by force of arms, but as a law of historical development. Just as capitalism had challenged feudalism, so communism was now challenging capitalism. We cannot regard all this as historical inevitability, was Kennedy's riposte. People must have free choice. Khrushchev struck back, comparing Kennedy's stance to that of the Spanish Inquisition. The United States wants to build a dam, blocking the development of the human mind and conscience. Ignoring the stinging accusation, Kennedy warned that a confrontation could get completely out of hand in the nuclear age. But the word he used to make his point, miscalculation, didn't work. To the Soviet leader, this sounded appallingly patronizing. Khrushchev exploded. A very vague word. And was the Soviet Union supposed to sit like a schoolboy with his hands on his desk? Over a lunch of coquille de foie gras and beef Wellington, washed down with 3 fine wines, the conversation lightened up, and the president at last managed to score a few points. When asked about the array of medals on his jacket, Khrushchev gestured with his chin. "This one is Lenin Peace Prize." "I hope you get to keep it," Kennedy shot back. Or so his press office quickly told reporters. With his charismatic manner and nifty spin doctors, Kennedy was up on points in the PR battle. But in private, the story was very different. "Is it always like this?" Kennedy asked Ambassador Thompson during the lunch break. "Par for the course," was the reply. But privately, Thompson was shaken that the president seemed to be taking one hit after another from the Soviet leader. In an effort at rational discussion, Kennedy had been pushed on the defensive in an ideological punch-up. For his part, Khrushchev had seen nothing to change his perception of Kennedy's weakness. His disdain for his opponent was, I think, rooted in his experience as a father. He once said, "Kennedy is as young as my son would be had he lived." It was a revealing aside.
Leonid, Khrushchev's eldest son, was born like John Kennedy in 1917.
Khruschev, не отставая, жмет по следу фрица. Прекрасная машина истребителя Яковлева. Не уйти от нее немцу.
A daredevil Air Force pilot during World War II, he was finally shot down and killed in 1943.
Так горел 29-й немецкий самолет.
His father, however, rarely talked about it. Perhaps from grief, but more likely because Leonid's pre-war life had been a decadent chronicle of drink and debauchery. So much so that in 1937, Khrushchev evicted him from the household.
For the Soviet leader to compare Kennedy to Leonid was hardly a compliment. He must have known from KGB reports that Kennedy was likewise an inveterate womanizer. If Khrushchev saw his own son across the table from him in Vienna, little wonder he found it hard to take the young president seriously.
After a stroll in the garden, the two men returned to the music room, this time alone except for interpreters. Possibly Kennedy thought Khrushchev might be more tractable away from his entourage. If so, it didn't work. Instead of moving on to specifics such as Germany or nuclear test bans, the president, most unwisely, said he wanted to come back to the general thesis about historical change.
Kennedy wanted to contest the same muddy ground that they had trodden before lunch. Perhaps he wasn't thinking clearly because of the pain and the drugs. Or maybe he just couldn't resist an intellectual argument, particularly when he'd lost the first round. So Kennedy warned Khrushchev that Soviet support for wars of national liberation could easily escalate into a general crisis through miscalculation. This time, Khrushchev did not flare up, but deflected Kennedy's point to his advantage. The president seems to believe that when people rise up against tyrants, that is the result of Moscow's activities. But this is not so.
In Iran, Khrushchev asserted, the people are so poor that the country has become a volcano and changes are bound to occur sooner or later. By supporting the Shah, the United States generated hostility towards itself and favourable feelings towards the Soviet Union. This, he said, was what had already happened in Cuba.
The United States was supporting old, moribund, reactionary regimes against the people's struggle for freedom. He jumped around the world to keep making his point, citing the Congo, Angola, Algeria. It was a brilliant series of palpable hits. Kennedy was on the back foot, and Khrushchev kept him there.
The afternoon meeting ended bleakly after 3.5 hours. For the Americans, the lack of preparation was proving fatal. Rather like Chamberlain in the face of Hitler's ranting, Kennedy was knocked off balance by his opponent's calculated aggression.
Thompson regretted later that the Americans hadn't worked out any very clear scenario in advance for the discussions. As for Khrushchev, according to his aide Oleg Troyanovsky, he returned from the first day puffed up with his performance against the urbane Harvard graduate, exclaiming,
"This man is very inexperienced, even immature."
Both leaders must have been tired as the talks finished late. Kennedy in particular was in acute pain from his back. But there was only a short time for a hot bath before the car whisked him off to the Schönbrunn Palace. The leaders and their wives were guests of honor at a formal dinner hosted by the Austrian president. Khrushchev stole the show by turning up in a business suit rather than bourgeois black tie. Kennedy arrived late and was not on best form. At one point, he nearly sat on Mrs. Khrushchev's substantial lap when she changed seats, rather suddenly. The Soviet leader spent most of the evening chatting up Jackie Kennedy, alternating between far-fetched anecdotes and long recitations of Soviet achievements. "Oh, Mr. Chairman," she finally exclaimed, "don't bore me with statistics." The next morning, the Kennedys attended 9 o'clock Mass at St. Stephen's Cathedral, while Khrushchev laid a wreath at the Soviet War Memorial. For both, it should have been a sobering reminder of the larger goal for which they had journeyed to the summit. But the only war they now seemed to be focusing on was their own personal duel. The summit resumed at 10:15 at the Grand Soviet Embassy on Reisnerstrasse. After the impasse of the previous evening, you might have expected each man to review tactics. But instead, they stuck doggedly to their guns. Kennedy's tone was still one of firm but rational discussion, seeking to explain and justify American policy. Khrushchev, tanked up by his success on day one, kept scoring debating points. They now reached what Kennedy privately called the Nutcracker, Berlin. But the president had come with no new proposals. He simply sat tight on the status quo. All his advisors at home had urged him to do this, and now the need was more pressing because of his ineffective performance on the previous day. As the two men circled around each other, their language became more and more extreme. Khrushchev went on the attack. Hitler said that Germany needed living space up to the Urals. And now, some of Hitler's generals are top commanders in NATO. Khrushchev then mentioned the 20 million Soviet dead from World War II, one of whom, he added cryptically, was his own son. Mikoyan, he said, had also lost a son, and Gromyko 2 brothers. The president said quietly that he too had lost a brother in the war. There was a moment of reflection on both sides. Khrushchev acknowledged that American mothers mourned their sons just as deeply as Soviet mothers, but he couldn't resist another dig, noting that the American death toll was only 350,000. Frustrated and emotional, the two men began to talk about open conflict. If America wants war over Germany, Khrushchev postured, let it be so. Kennedy cut back. If you sign a peace treaty with East Germany that denies us our rights, that would be an act of war. We will go ahead and sign such a treaty, Khrushchev declared. And on that cliffhanger, the two sides adjourned for lunch. Determined not to be outdone, the Soviets had laid on an even grander spread than the Americans. A feast of caviar, fish pie, chicken and ice cream, washed down by 4 choice wines. Officially, lunch was the last act of the summit. But Kennedy wanted one more round, desperate to convince Khrushchev that he was playing with fire. So he asked for a few words in private. I have gained the impression, said Kennedy, that the Soviet Union is presenting me with the alternative of having to accept its position on Berlin or having a face-to-face confrontation. If America wants war, that's its problem, Khrushchev shot back. It's not the Soviet Union that threatens war. It's the United States. I'm not the one trying to force through a change. Our decision to sign a peace treaty is irrevocable. We shall do so in December if there's no agreement. The President concluded the conversation by observing that it would be a cold winter. It's clear that Kennedy was shaken by the whole experience. His firm but pragmatic approach had failed. He hadn't risen above the bluster or ideological posturing. When he poured out his experiences next day to Harold Macmillan in London, the British Prime Minister thought it sounded like Chamberlain trying to hold a conversation with Hitler. To an American journalist, the president confided that it was
the roughest thing in my life. He just beat the hell out of me, so I've got a terrible problem. If he thinks I'm inexperienced and have no guts, until we remove those ideas, we won't get anywhere with it.
After returning to the United States, Kennedy was forced to take a complete rest in Florida, and his press office finally admitted that the president was on crutches. As he had dreaded, this news added to the general perception of weakness. By contrast, Khrushchev was in great form. One veteran Western reporter in Moscow said he looked more exuberant and relaxed than in years. The Central Committee praised him for conducting the Vienna talks with great skill and in an aggressive spirit. Each leader read the summit very differently. Khrushchev, with ego inflated, was confirmed in his contempt for Kennedy. The president felt he had to react extravagantly to rebuild his credibility. What each man did next took the world into the darkest moments of the Cold War. While Kennedy was recuperating in Florida, Soviet warnings left no doubt that the situation in Berlin was building to a crisis. The Berlin escape hatch for refugees was clearly going to be closed. But how this would be done and whether violence would ensue were less evident.
Kennedy knew that after botching the Bay of Pigs, he couldn't afford another mistake. Yet the possible cost of standing firm appalled him. The Pentagon estimated that 70 million Americans, nearly half the nation, would die in an all-out nuclear exchange with the Soviets.
So Kennedy dismissed hardline advice for a military confrontation over Berlin. But he knew he had to find another way to win this battle of wills with Khrushchev. Still on crutches, he hobbled to the Oval Office on the evening of the 25th of July to speak over radio and television to the American people.
West Berlin has now become, as never before, the great testing place
another $3 billion for the armed forces. And he declared,
"We seek peace, but we shall not surrender. That is the central meaning of this crisis and the meaning of this government's policy."
The speech was acclaimed at home. After weeks of drift, Kennedy had reasserted American will and leadership. More important, it seems to have rattled Khrushchev. The East German leader, Walter Ulbricht, had wanted a military takeover of West Berlin. But Khrushchev now felt this was too dangerous. He gave Ulbricht the go-ahead to seal East Berlin from West Berlin, but warned him to start with barbed wire, monitoring the Western reaction before proceeding to a concrete wall. There was outrage in West Germany, but silence from the White House. The president, like his advisers, was surprised yet relieved by the Soviet solution.
Kennedy joked privately that a wall is a hell of a lot better than a war. For the president, this was something of a recovery after the setbacks of Vienna. For the West, the Berlin Wall became a propaganda triumph, graphically illustrating that communists did not live in a free society.
Khrushchev had momentarily lost his nerve. He'd backed away from a direct military confrontation. But he still rated Kennedy on the same level as his no-good son Leonid. Increasingly desperate for a big score in the Cold War, Khrushchev decided to stake all on a gambler's throw.
The new intelligence photos are in, and now the evidence is unmistakable. It shows Russian IL-28 Beagle bombers capable of carrying nuclear weapons, and it shows more offensive ballistic missiles being emplaced.
He installed nuclear missiles in Cuba, within easy striking distance of America's eastern seaboard.
All of the Western Hemisphere, from Hudson Bay to Lima, Peru, is within their range.
Khrushchev called it throwing a hedgehog down Uncle Sam's pants. The idea didn't take shape until the spring of 1962, but it was rooted in the Vienna Summit and his reading of Kennedy.
I call upon Chairman Khrushchev to halt and eliminate this clandestine, reckless, and provocative threat to world peace and to stable relations between our two nations. I call upon him further to abandon this course of world domination.
The Cuban Missile Crisis took the world to the brink of nuclear war. This was precisely the danger Kennedy had tried to warn against when he talked about miscalculation. As over Berlin, Kennedy struck a balance between firmness and provocation. Despite pressure from the military hawks, he rejected airstrikes on Cuba and instead imposed a blockade on the island.
It was the Soviet Union's turn to call the next move. Soviet ships approaching Cuba knew the United States Navy had orders to intercept them.
This gave Khrushchev time to rethink. Deep down, he knew that his bluff had been called. If it came to nuclear war, the Soviet arsenal was far inferior to that of the Americans. After a palpitating face-off, he decided to remove the missiles. The superpowers had been eyeball to eyeball, and Moscow blinked first. Only then, according to one of Khrushchev's closest aides, did the Soviet leader stop doubting his adversary's will and intellect. But it was too late.
Humiliated in the missile crisis, Khrushchev was ousted in a Kremlin coup in October 1964 and carefully airbrushed out of recent Soviet history. But at least it had been a peaceful transition. Khrushchev reflected wryly that if someone had told Stalin to resign, not even a wet spot would have remained where he'd been standing.
But Vienna led to miscalculation on the American side as well. During an interview with one journalist immediately after the summit, Kennedy talked of the need to prove American toughness as a superpower.
We have a problem in trying to make our power credible. Vietnam looks like the place.
In Vietnam, like Germany, a country divided by the Cold War, the US had been providing financial aid to the pro-American South. But now Kennedy decided to take a firm stand against communist insurgents. Determined to prove after Vienna that this president would not be pushed around, he greatly increased America's commitments, sending in a total of 16,000 military advisors. He could see the risks of being sucked in, but felt he had no choice but to draw the Cold War line in Vietnam.
It appears as though something has happened in the motorcade route. Something, I repeat, has happened in the motorcade route. There's numerous people running up the hill alongside Elm Street, there by the Simmons Freeway. Several police officers are rushing up the hill at this time. Stand by just a moment, please. Something has happened.
By the time of his assassination in November 1963, gunned down by a communist sympathizer in Dallas, Kennedy had set up the conditions for America's longest and most traumatic war, in which more than 50,000 Americans died before South Vietnam fell to the communists.
Vienna should never have happened. The problem wasn't a missile gap, it was a personality gap. Kennedy and Khrushchev each constructed his own mistaken image of the other. Their disastrous duel poisoned superpower relations and nearly sparked World War III. This was a summit that cast a long shadow.
Stay tuned to BBC4 for a Nation on Film special next.
The superpowers. The Soviet Union seemed to be winning the space race and was widely believed to have opened up a missile gap in nuclear weapons. And the Americans and Soviets were facing off in Berlin, which, it was feared, could be the flashpoint for a catastrophic Third World War. The stakes were therefore immense when John F. Kennedy, the new young American president, met Nikita Khrushchev, the veteran Soviet leader, in Vienna in June 1961. Both men craved international success to silence critics at home. And each was convinced he could achieve what he wanted. These were two huge egos shot through with vulnerabilities. Vienna exposed the very human frailties of two world leaders. Khrushchev, but also unthreatening. Not least because at 5'1", he was even shorter than the self-conscious dictator. So it was easy to underestimate this coarse little man with his piggy eyes and ceaseless talk. But after Stalin's death, Khrushchev sidelined one rival after another to become the undisputed leader of his country.
Yet behind the bullish exterior, Khrushchev was a complex figure. He was sensitive to any hint of condescension about his lack of culture and education, and unlike Stalin, he found it hard to control his explosive temper, often alternating from effusive good humour to foul-mouthed abuse in a few moments. This was no natural diplomat.
In the 20th century, the Summit Conference was reinvented. Air travel allowed statesmen to confront each other on a world stage. Mass media communicated their decisions instantly to a truly global audience. But does summitry make the world a safer place? When leaders meet, the aim is to resolve disputes and ease tension. But sometimes the verbal duel becomes so vicious that it scars the whole relationship. (1961). One of the tensest moments of the Cold War between World War. This is the story of how and why a summit can go horribly wrong. The push for a summit came from a new man in the Kremlin. Nikita Khrushchev was the son of poor peasants from southern Russia. Clever and ambitious, but uneducated, he wanted to become an engineer. But after the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, he threw himself into politics. He was party boss in the Ukraine and a political commissar at Stalingrad. He rose rapidly as Stalin's pet. Exuberant, energetic and loyal, with his deep inferiority complex and fiery temper that pushed him to posture and score points at every opportunity. Kennedy, a far cry from the youthful icon, still feeling his way into an unfamiliar role. Crippled by intense back pain and pumped up by powerful drugs. The result was a massive clash of personalities played out over 2 days. It created profound misunderstandings and worse, misguided policies, pushing the world to the brink of nuclear destruction over Cuba and dragging America into a war in Vietnam that almost tore the country apart. Vienna in 1961 is a rare case of how jaw can nearly provoke war. It was, I think, the most ill-judged encounter of the Cold